Rachel Sterling stepped out of her black BMW in downtown Manhattan, her Louboutin heels clicking against the pavement with the sharp precision of someone who had never doubted her place at the top of the world's food chain. At 34, she was the youngest partner at Morrison, Blake & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms, and she wore her success like armor against anyone who might dare to suggest she hadn't earned every ruthless victory. The morning had already been brutal: a conference call with clients who were questioning her strategy, a partnership meeting where the senior partners had criticized her aggressive approach to negotiations, and a court appearance where the judge had publicly reprimanded her for what he called unnecessarily hostile behavior toward opposing counsel. Rachel's entire identity was built on being tougher, smarter, and more ruthless than anyone else in the room. She'd clawed her way out of a middle-class background through sheer force of will, working 18-hour days and sacrificing every relationship that might slow down her climb to the top. But lately, the victories had been feeling hollow, and the criticism had been getting under her skin in ways that made her question whether the person she'd become was worth the cost of becoming her. As Rachel approached the entrance to her office building, she noticed a pregnant woman sitting on the sidewalk near the building's entrance, obviously homeless and clearly struggling. The woman, who appeared to be in her early 20s with long dark hair and exhausted eyes, was holding a small cardboard sign and trying to stay warm in clothes that had seen too many nights on the street. "Please help," the sign read in careful handwriting. "Pregnant and need food." The sight of the homeless woman triggered something ugly in Rachel's chest, a combination of disgust, fear, and resentment that she couldn't quite name. Here was someone who represented everything Rachel had fought to escape: vulnerability, dependence, the possibility that life could knock you down and leave you with nothing. "Excuse me," Rachel said, her voice sharp with irritation, "you can't sit here. This is private property." The pregnant woman looked up with the kind of weary resignation that suggested she'd had this conversation many times before. "I'm sorry," the woman said quietly, her voice carrying a slight accent. "I was just resting for a moment. I'll move." But instead of stepping aside to let the woman gather her things, Rachel felt something cold and cruel take over. The same ruthless energy that had made her successful in the courtroom but had been slowly poisoning every other aspect of her life. "You'll move now," Rachel said, her voice rising loud enough to attract the attention of other pedestrians. "I don't care what your sob story is. I don't care what excuses you have. I'm tired of people like you thinking the world owes you something just because you made bad choices. Have you ever been so angry at your own life that you took it out on someone who represented everything you feared becoming?" The pregnant woman began collecting her things with obvious difficulty, her movements slow and careful in the way that suggested advanced pregnancy and poor health. "Please," the woman said, "I'm not asking for anything from you. I'll just—" "You're asking for something from everyone who has to look at you," Rachel interrupted, her voice taking on the cruel precision she usually reserved for destroying witnesses in court. "You're asking us to feel sorry for you, to pretend that your situation isn't the result of your own failures and bad decisions." A small crowd of pedestrians had stopped to watch the confrontation, some pulling out phones to record what was clearly escalating into something ugly. Rachel was aware of the audience, but instead of feeling embarrassed by her behavior, she felt emboldened. Here was an opportunity to release all the frustration and anger that had been building up from her terrible morning, her stalled career advancement, and her growing sense that success hadn't brought her the satisfaction she'd expected. "Let me guess," Rachel continued, stepping closer to the pregnant woman with the aggressive energy of a predator sensing weakness. "Teenage pregnancy? Dropped out of school? Drug problem? Bad boyfriend who left you when things got difficult?" The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she continued trying to gather her belongings and move away from Rachel's verbal assault. "I worked 3 jobs before I got sick," the woman said quietly, though her voice carried dignity despite her circumstances. "I was studying to be a nurse. I lost my apartment when I couldn't work anymore because of pregnancy complications." "Excuses," Rachel said with dismissive contempt. "Everyone has a hard luck story. The difference between successful people and people like you is that successful people take responsibility for their lives instead of sitting on sidewalks expecting other people to solve their problems." Rachel reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, but instead of offering it to the woman, she held it just out of reach. "You want this money?" Rachel asked with cruelty that made several onlookers gasp. "Tell everyone here that your situation is your own fault. Tell them you made bad choices and that you're not entitled to anyone's sympathy." The pregnant woman stared at Rachel with an expression that mixed hurt, dignity, and something approaching pity for the kind of person Rachel had revealed herself to be. "I don't want your money," the woman said softly, standing up with obvious difficulty and the kind of grace that made Rachel's cruelty look petty and small. "And I don't want your anger. I hope whatever is hurting you inside gets better." The response, compassion in the face of cruelty, made Rachel even angrier because it highlighted the contrast between the pregnant woman's character and her own behavior. "Don't you dare condescend to me," Rachel said, stepping forward aggressively enough that the pregnant woman stumbled backward in fear. That's when Rachel made the mistake that would change her life forever. In a moment of rage that she would replay in her mind for months to come, Rachel shoved the pregnant woman, sending her tumbling backward onto the concrete sidewalk while the growing crowd of witnesses gasped in shock and horror. The pregnant woman cried out as she hit the pavement, immediately clutching her stomach with obvious pain and fear for her unborn child. "Oh my God," someone in the crowd shouted. "Someone call an ambulance." As Rachel stood over the woman she just attacked, looking down at the consequences of her cruelty, she noticed a man in an expensive suit stepping out of a black car that had been parked across the street. David Chun approached the scene with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, his expression unreadable as he assessed what had just happened. Rachel had no idea that she'd just committed assault in front of one of the most powerful men in New York, or that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. David knelt beside the pregnant woman, speaking to her in gentle tones while simultaneously pulling out his phone to call for medical assistance. "Don't worry," David said to the woman, "help is on the way. You're going to be okay." Then he looked up at Rachel Sterling with an expression that would haunt her dreams. Not anger exactly, but something far more dangerous. The calm certainty of someone who had just witnessed an injustice and possessed both the power and the determination to ensure it had consequences. For hours before Rachel Sterling attacked a pregnant homeless woman on a Manhattan sidewalk, she had been sitting in her corner office at Morrison, Blake & Associates, staring at a framed photo of herself receiving the Young Lawyer of the Year award while wondering why achieving everything she'd ever wanted felt like slowly dying inside. Rachel's transformation from idealistic law student to ruthless corporate attorney hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual erosion of empathy, compassion, and connection that had left her successful but spiritually bankrupt. Growing up in a working-class family in Queens, Rachel had watched her parents struggle to make ends meet despite working multiple jobs and making countless sacrifices. Her father drove a city bus during the day and worked security at night. Her mother cleaned office buildings and took in sewing work to help pay for Rachel's school supplies and college application fees. "Education is the only way out," her mother, Carmen Sterling, had told Rachel repeatedly. "You're smart enough to have opportunities we never had, but you have to fight for every single one of them." Rachel had taken that advice to heart, graduating valedictorian from high school, earning a full scholarship to Columbia University, and finishing law school in the top 5% of her class. But somewhere during her climb to success, fighting for opportunities had transformed into fighting against anyone who represented vulnerability or need. The transformation had accelerated during her early years at Morrison, Blake & Associates, where she'd quickly learned that empathy was viewed as weakness and that the lawyers who advanced fastest were those willing to destroy opposing counsel, intimidate witnesses, and treat every case as a war to be won regardless of collateral damage. Rachel, her mentor David Morrison, had told her during her second year at the firm, "You have the potential to be a true killer in this business. But you need to understand that success requires sacrificing parts of yourself that might make you feel good but will definitely make you weak." Rachel had embraced that philosophy with the fervor of someone trying to outrun her own background. She'd worked harder than anyone else, billed more hours, won more cases, and gradually built a reputation as the lawyer you hired when you needed someone destroyed professionally and personally. But the person she'd become in pursuit of success bore little resemblance to the idealistic young woman who had entered law school hoping to help people navigate complex legal systems. When you achieve everything you thought you wanted but discover that the person you became in pursuit of those goals is someone you don't recognize or like, how do you find your way back to yourself? Rachel's personal life had become as empty as her professional life was full. She'd driven away friends who tried to maintain connection with the person she used to be. She'd ended a 3-year relationship with Marcus, a public defender who'd accused her of becoming someone who uses her talents to make the world worse instead of better. "Rachel," Marcus had said during their final argument, I fell in love with someone who wanted to fight for justice. I don't know who you've become, but she's not someone I can love or respect." The breakup had been devastating, but Rachel had channeled her pain into even more ruthless professional performance, telling herself that success was more reliable than love and that financial security was more important than emotional connection. The morning that would change everything had started with a partnership meeting where the senior partners had expressed concerns about Rachel's approach to client relationships and courtroom behavior. "Rachel," Margaret Blake had said, "your legal skills are exceptional, but we're getting complaints about your interpersonal style. Clients are saying you're difficult to work with. Opposing counsel have filed formal complaints about your behavior during depositions." The criticism had stung because Rachel had believed that her aggressive approach was what the firm valued and rewarded. "I thought you wanted results," Rachel had replied. "I thought winning cases was more important than being liked." "Winning cases is important," David Morrison had agreed, "but so is maintaining the firm's reputation for professionalism. We need you to find ways to be effective without alienating everyone you work with." The meeting had ended with a warning that Rachel's partnership track could be jeopardized if she didn't adjust her approach, a threat that had sent her into a spiral of anger and self-doubt about whether the person she'd become was sustainable or successful in the long term. The court appearance that followed had been even more humiliating. Judge Patricia Walsh had stopped proceedings to address Rachel's hostile questioning of a witness. "Ms. Sterling," Judge Walsh had said, "your behavior toward this witness is inappropriate and unprofessional. This court will not tolerate intimidation tactics disguised as legal strategy." The public reprimand had been witnessed by colleagues, opposing counsel, and law students who were observing the proceedings. Rachel had felt her carefully constructed reputation cracking under the weight of criticism from someone whose opinion carried real authority. By the time Rachel left the courthouse and returned to her car, she'd been consumed by a rage that had nowhere to go and no constructive outlet. She'd built her entire identity around being tough, aggressive, and dominant, but the feedback she was receiving suggested that those qualities were becoming liabilities rather than assets. The pregnant homeless woman outside her office building had become an unfortunate target for Rachel's displaced anger and frustration. Someone who represented everything Rachel feared about vulnerability, dependence, and the possibility that life could knock down anyone regardless of their efforts or achievements. But what Rachel didn't know was that her attack on the pregnant woman was being witnessed by David Chun, the billionaire philanthropist whose foundation funded legal aid clinics, homeless shelters, and programs that provided exactly the kind of support Rachel had just mocked. David Chun had built his fortune through real estate development, but he dedicated his wealth to addressing systemic issues that created homelessness, poverty, and inequality. He'd been driving through downtown Manhattan after a meeting with city officials about expanding affordable housing when he'd witnessed Rachel's assault. David's response to injustice wasn't typically emotional or impulsive. He preferred strategic, long-term interventions that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. But watching a successful professional attack a vulnerable pregnant woman had triggered something in him that demanded immediate and comprehensive action. As the ambulance arrived to check on the pregnant woman's condition and ensure her baby was safe, David had been making phone calls that would begin the process of teaching Rachel Sterling exactly what consequences looked like when someone with unlimited resources decided to address cruelty with justice. Rachel Sterling was about to learn that attacking someone in front of David Chun wasn't just assault. It was a career-ending mistake that would force her to confront the person she'd become and decide whether she was capable of becoming someone better. The first humiliation came 6 hours after Rachel Sterling's attack on the pregnant woman, when she discovered that David Chun, the man who had witnessed her assault, was not just a random bystander, but the billionaire philanthropist whose foundation was Morrison, Blake and Associates' largest client. Rachel was sitting in her office, trying to focus on contract reviews while battling the nagging anxiety that had plagued her since the morning's incident, when her assistant Jennifer knocked on the door with an expression that suggested serious trouble. "Rachel," Jennifer said, "Mr. Morrison wants to see you in the conference room immediately. He said to bring the Chin Foundation files." The mention of the Chin Foundation made Rachel's stomach drop. The Chin Foundation was responsible for nearly 30% of the firm's annual revenue, funding legal aid clinics, affordable housing projects, and civil rights litigation that provided both financial stability and prestigious reputation enhancement for Morrison, Blake and Associates. "Did he say what this was about?" Rachel asked, though she was beginning to suspect that her morning encounter might be connected to this sudden summons. "He just said it was urgent and that you should bring everything related to the Chin Foundation account," Jennifer replied, her expression troubled in ways that suggested she'd picked up on ominous undertones in Morrison's instructions. Rachel gathered the requested files with growing dread, her mind racing through the implications of a meeting that connected her behavior with the firm's most important client relationship. The conference room was already occupied when Rachel arrived. David Morrison sat at the head of the table with an expression that mixed disappointment with barely controlled anger. Margaret Blake was reviewing documents with the focused intensity she usually reserved for preparing termination meetings. And at the far end of the table sat David Chen himself, watching Rachel with the calm attention of someone evaluating a problem that needed to be solved. "Rachel," David Morrison said, "please have a seat. Mr. Chen has some concerns about the firm's representation that we need to discuss." Rachel settled into her chair, acutely aware that David Chen was studying her with obvious recognition. He was the man who had witnessed her attack on the pregnant woman, and now she was discovering that he was also the client whose opinion could determine her professional future. "Ms. Sterling," David Chen said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his voice, "I understand you're the attorney handling several of our foundation's cases." "Yes," Rachel replied, though her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. "I've been managing the affordable housing litigation and the employment discrimination cases." "Cases involving vulnerable populations," David Chen observed. "People who are homeless, unemployed, facing discrimination based on their economic status or background." The emphasis on vulnerable populations was clearly intentional, designed to highlight the contrast between Rachel's professional responsibilities and her personal behavior. "That's correct," Rachel said, beginning to understand that she was being maneuvered into acknowledging the hypocrisy of attacking someone whose circumstances were identical to those of her clients. "When your public actions contradict your professional responsibilities, how do you defend behavior that reveals the gap between who you claim to be and who you actually are?" "Ms. Sterling," David Chen continued, "I have to ask you a direct question, and I hope you'll answer honestly. Do you believe that homeless individuals deserve dignity and respect?" The question was a trap that would force Rachel to either lie about her beliefs or admit that her behavior contradicted her stated professional values. "Of course," Rachel said, though her answer sounded defensive rather than confident. "And do you believe that pregnant women facing economic hardship deserve protection rather than persecution?" David Chen asked. "Yes," Rachel replied, understanding that each question was building toward a confrontation she couldn't avoid. "Then perhaps you can explain," David Chen said, pulling out his phone and setting it on the conference table, "why this morning I witnessed you physically assault a pregnant homeless woman outside your office building." David Chen pressed play on a video that showed Rachel's attack from multiple angles, footage that had apparently been captured by security cameras and witness phones during the incident. Rachel watched herself shove the pregnant woman, heard her own voice delivering cruel accusations and demands, saw the woman fall backward onto the concrete while clutching her stomach in fear for her unborn child. "Jesus Christ, Rachel," David Morrison breathed, staring at the video with obvious horror. "What the hell is wrong with you?" "Furthermore," David Chen continued, "I have a recording of the verbal abuse that preceded the physical assault. Would you like to hear yourself telling a pregnant woman that her situation was the result of her own failures? Demanding that she humiliate herself for $20. Rachel felt heat rising in her cheeks as she confronted the evidence of her cruelty displayed for her colleagues and her most important client. "Mr. Chen," Rachel said, "I was having a difficult morning. I'm not proud of my behavior, but it was an isolated incident that doesn't reflect." "Doesn't reflect what?" David Chen interrupted. "Your true character? Your professional values? Your commitment to helping vulnerable populations?" David Morrison leaned forward with an expression that suggested Rachel's career at the firm was in serious jeopardy. "Rachel," David Morrison said, "in 30 years of practice, I have never been more embarrassed by an employee's behavior. You attacked a pregnant woman. In public. While serving as counsel for a foundation dedicated to protecting exactly those kinds of vulnerable individuals." That's when Rachel made a decision that would reveal both her desperation and her continued inability to accept responsibility for her actions, a small act of defiance that would make her situation infinitely worse. With all due respect, Rachel said, her voice taking on the aggressive tone that had gotten her into trouble earlier, my personal behavior outside of work hours shouldn't be subject to professional scrutiny. What I do on my own time is not the firm's business. The conference room fell silent as everyone processed Rachel's attempt to defend the indefensible. Personal behavior? David Chun repeated, his voice carrying dangerous quiet. Ms. Sterling, you physically assaulted a pregnant woman. You committed a crime in broad daylight while representing a foundation that funds programs to help exactly the kind of person you attacked. Moreover, Margaret Blake added, you seem to be suggesting that Morrison, Blake and Associates should employ attorneys who commit assault when they're having difficult mornings. Rachel realized that her attempt to minimize her behavior had backfired spectacularly, revealing that she still didn't understand the severity of her actions or their professional implications. I think there's been an overreaction to what was essentially a minor incident, Rachel said, doubling down on her defensiveness. The woman wasn't seriously injured. She's probably dealt with worse situations living on the streets. David Chun stood up with the deliberate movements of someone who had heard enough to make a decision that would change Rachel's life permanently. Ms. Sterling, David Chun said, I want you to understand something very clearly. The woman you attacked is named Maria Santos. She's 23 years old, 7 months pregnant, and was working 3 jobs as a certified nursing assistant before pregnancy complications forced her to stop working. He pulled out another document and placed it in front of Rachel. Ms. Santos was studying to become a registered nurse through a program funded by the Chun Foundation. She lost her apartment when medical bills from her pregnancy consumed her savings. She's been homeless for 6 weeks while trying to find work that accommodates her medical restrictions. Rachel stared at the document, understanding that David Chun had investigated Maria Santos' background and discovered that she was exactly the kind of person the foundation existed to help. In other words, David Chun continued, you physically assaulted one of our scholarship recipients while she was facing the exact circumstances our legal aid programs are designed to address. As Rachel absorbed the full scope of her mistake, attacking not just any pregnant woman, but someone directly connected to her biggest client, she realized that her moment of cruelty had just cost her everything she'd worked to achieve. The escalation began when David Chun made an announcement that would transform Rachel's life from professional humiliation to complete personal and career destruction, but with an unexpected twist that would force her to confront the possibility of redemption through service. Ms. Sterling, David Chun said, standing at the head of the conference room table with the authority of someone about to deliver a life-changing verdict, the Chun Foundation is terminating all relationships with Morrison, Blake and Associates effective immediately. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face as she processed what David Chun had just announced. The loss of the Chun Foundation account would eliminate nearly a third of the firm's revenue and potentially force layoffs among associates and support staff. David Morrison said, his voice carrying panic as he realized the scope of the professional disaster Rachel had created. Surely we can discuss this situation and find a resolution that doesn't require such drastic action. Can we? David Chun replied, looking directly at Rachel with an expression that mixed disappointment with something approaching pity. Ms. Sterling physically assaulted one of our scholarship recipients while serving as counsel for programs designed to protect vulnerable populations. What discussion could possibly justify continuing that relationship? Margaret Blake leaned forward with the focused intensity of someone trying to salvage a business relationship worth millions of dollars. Mr. Chun, Margaret said, Rachel's behavior was completely unacceptable, and she will face appropriate consequences within the firm. But surely the actions of one attorney shouldn't jeopardize the important work we're doing together on behalf of thousands of people who need legal representation. David Chun considered Margaret's argument, then pulled out a folder that contained information that would reveal the full scope of his investigation into Rachel's behavior. Ms. Blake, David Chun said, I've spent the past 6 hours reviewing Ms. Sterling's case files, interviewing her former clients, and researching her professional conduct over the past 3 years. He opened the folder to reveal documents that made Rachel's face go white with recognition and fear. Ms. Sterling has a pattern of hostile behavior toward vulnerable clients, aggressive tactics that traumatize witnesses, and a general approach to legal practice that treats poverty and desperation as weakness to be exploited rather than circumstances requiring compassion. David Chun began reading from complaint letters and incident reports that Rachel thought had been buried in personnel files. Maria Gonzalez, domestic violence survivor, Miss Sterling made me feel like my situation was my fault and that I was wasting the court's time. Thomas Washington, homeless veteran, she acted like I was lying about my disabilities and treated me like I was trying to scam the system. When someone compiles evidence of your cruelty over time, how do you face the pattern of behavior that reveals who you've truly become? Rachel realized that David Chun hadn't just witnessed her attack on Maria Santos. He'd used his resources to investigate her entire professional history and discovered a pattern of behavior that contradicted everything the Chun Foundation stood for. Furthermore, David Chun continued, I've learned that Ms. Sterling has been billing the Chun Foundation for work that was performed primarily by junior associates while she focused on more lucrative private clients. The allegation of billing irregularities sent shockwaves through the conference room. David Morrison's expression shifted from embarrassment to anger as he realized that Rachel's behavior might have legal as well as professional implications. Rachel, David Morrison said, his voice cold with fury, is that accusation accurate? Rachel found herself trapped between admitting to billing fraud and continuing to defend behavior that was clearly indefensible. I supervised all the work that was billed to the Chun Foundation, Rachel said, though her voice lacked conviction. Standard practice allows for billing supervisory time even when junior associates perform the actual research and document preparation. Standard practice, David Chun said, doesn't usually involve billing 40 hours a week for supervision while spending 3 hours a week reviewing junior associate work. The specificity of David Chen's information revealed that he'd conducted a comprehensive audit of Rachel's billing practices and discovered systematic abuse of the client relationship. That's when David Chun announced the twist that would change the entire trajectory of Rachel's consequences and offer her an unexpected path toward redemption. However, David Chun said, I'm prepared to offer Ms. Sterling an alternative to immediate termination and potential legal proceedings for billing fraud. Rachel looked up with desperate hope, expecting some kind of financial settlement or professional rehabilitation program. Ms. Sterling, David Chun continued, you will take an immediate leave of absence from Morrison, Blake and Associates. You will spend the next 6 months working directly with Maria Santos, providing her with comprehensive support as she prepares for motherhood and completes her nursing program. The proposal was so unexpected that Rachel couldn't immediately process what David Chun was suggesting. Working with her? Rachel repeated. You will serve as Ms. Santos' personal assistant, advocate, and support system, David Chun explained. You will help her find stable housing, navigate medical care, complete her nursing certification, and prepare for her baby's arrival. David Morrison stared at David Chun with confusion about the purpose of such an arrangement. Mr. Chun, David Morrison said, I'm not sure I understand how that arrangement benefits anyone involved. It benefits Ms. Sterling, David Chun replied, by giving her an opportunity to understand the circumstances of the people she's been so cruel toward. It benefits Ms. Santos by providing her with resources and advocacy during a critical period in her life. David Chun looked directly at Rachel with an expression that mixed challenge with opportunity. And it benefits everyone by testing whether Ms. Sterling is capable of growth, empathy, and the kind of personal transformation that might allow her to return to legal practice as someone who uses her skills to help rather than harm vulnerable populations. Rachel felt a mixture of horror and confusion as she processed David Chen's proposal. He was offering her an alternative to professional destruction, but it would require her to spend 6 months serving the woman she'd attacked. What if I refuse? Rachel asked. Then I proceed with terminating the Foundation's relationship with your firm, filing criminal charges for the assault, pursuing civil litigation for billing fraud, and ensuring that your behavior becomes public knowledge through media coverage that will end your legal career permanently, David Chun replied with matter-of-fact certainty. The alternative to David Chen's proposal was complete personal and professional annihilation. Mr. Chun, Margaret Blake said, what would happen to Ms. Sterling's position at the firm during this arrangement? Ms. Sterling would remain employed but on unpaid leave, David Chun replied. Her return to practice would be contingent on successfully completing her service to Ms. Santos and demonstrating genuine personal growth through the experience. Rachel realized that David Chun was offering her something unprecedented, not just consequences for her cruelty, but an opportunity to transform herself through direct service to the person she'd harmed. Furthermore, David Chun added, Ms. Sterling's salary during her leave would be donated to programs that support pregnant women facing homelessness. She'll live on the same public assistance that Ms. Santos receives, experiencing firsthand the circumstances she's been so quick to judge. The proposal would strip away every privilege and advantage that had insulated Rachel from understanding the realities faced by the people she'd been serving professionally but dismissing personally. "I need time to consider this," Rachel said, though she understood that she had no real choice between David Chen's proposal and complete destruction of her life and career. "You have until tomorrow morning," David Chen replied. "Ms. Santos is currently staying at the downtown women's shelter. If you accept my terms, you'll meet her there at 8 a.m. to begin your service." As the meeting ended and David Chen left the conference room, Rachel sat in stunned silence as she confronted a choice that would determine not just her professional future, but the kind of person she would become through the process of learning to serve rather than dominate someone whose circumstances she'd never bothered to understand. The emotional breakthrough that would transform Rachel Sterling's understanding of herself and others came 3 weeks into her service to Maria Santos, when a medical emergency forced Rachel to confront the depth of her own fear and the courage Maria had been showing every day just to survive. Rachel had been living in a small efficiency apartment near the shelter, surviving on the same public assistance benefits that Maria received, and spending her days helping Maria navigate the complex systems that determined access to health care, housing assistance, and job training programs. The experience had been humbling in ways Rachel hadn't anticipated. She discovered that obtaining basic services required hours of waiting in crowded offices, completing forms that seemed designed to discourage rather than help applicants, and dealing with caseworkers who were overworked, underfunded, and sometimes openly hostile to people seeking assistance. "I had no idea it was this complicated," Rachel had admitted to Maria after spending an entire morning trying to help her apply for prenatal nutrition assistance. "The system seems designed to prevent people from getting help rather than providing it." "Now you understand," Maria had replied with the patient wisdom of someone who had been navigating these systems since her pregnancy had forced her to stop working. "It's not just about needing help, it's about proving you deserve help over and over again, to people who act like helping you is doing you a personal favor." But the real transformation in their relationship had come when Rachel began to see Maria not as a charity case or a professional obligation, but as a remarkable young woman whose strength and determination put Rachel's own complaints about difficulty into perspective. Maria Santos was completing her nursing certification through online courses while living in a shelter, working part-time jobs that accommodated her pregnancy restrictions, and preparing to raise a child alone while maintaining an optimism and grace that Rachel had never possessed even during her most privileged moments. "How do you stay positive?" Rachel had asked one evening as they reviewed Maria's nursing school materials together. "How do you keep believing things will work out when everything seems so overwhelming?" "Because my baby deserves a mother who believes in possibilities," Maria had replied simply. "I can't control everything that happens to us, but I can control whether I give up or keep fighting." When someone facing far greater challenges than you've ever experienced teaches you about resilience and hope, how does it change your understanding of what true strength looks like? The breakthrough moment came on a Tuesday morning when Maria began experiencing severe abdominal pain during what should have been a routine prenatal appointment. The doctor immediately ordered emergency tests and informed them that Maria was showing signs of preeclampsia, a potentially life-threatening condition that required immediate monitoring and possible early delivery. "Ms. Santos," Dr. Patricia Williams said, "we need to admit you to the hospital immediately. This condition can be dangerous for both you and your baby if we don't manage it carefully." Rachel watched Maria's face as she processed the news, seeing fear replace the calm strength that had characterized her approach to every previous challenge. "I can't afford a hospital stay," Maria said quietly. "My insurance has coverage limits, and I'm already close to my maximum benefits for the year." "Maria," Rachel said, "don't worry about the money. We'll figure out the financial part. Right now, you and the baby need medical care." But as they were preparing for Maria's admission, Rachel overheard a conversation between hospital administrators that revealed the scope of the financial challenge they were facing. "The Santos case will probably require several days of monitoring, possible early delivery, and extended neonatal care if the baby comes early," one administrator said. "Without insurance authorization, we're looking at bills in the $50,000 to $70,000 range." Rachel felt panic rising in her chest as she realized that Maria was facing a medical crisis that could bankrupt her even as it threatened her life and her baby's health. That's when Rachel made a decision that surprised even herself, a choice that revealed how completely her priorities had shifted during her weeks of service. "Excuse me," Rachel said, approaching the hospital administrators with the confidence that had once intimidated opposing counsel. "I'm Maria Santos' advocate, and I need to discuss her coverage options." Rachel spent the next 2 hours on the phone with insurance companies, patient advocacy services, and financial assistance programs, using her legal training and negotiation skills to secure emergency coverage that would protect Maria from devastating medical bills. But more importantly, Rachel found herself genuinely afraid for Maria's well-being in ways that had nothing to do with her own professional obligations or David Chen's requirements. "Please let her be okay," Rachel whispered as she sat in the hospital waiting room while Maria underwent tests and monitoring. "Please let the baby be okay." The prayer was spontaneous and honest, revealing that Rachel's concern for Maria had become personal rather than just transactional. When Dr. Williams emerged with test results, Rachel stood up with the same anxiety she'd once felt waiting for verdicts in her most important cases. "The good news," Dr. Williams said, "is that we caught the preeclampsia early enough to manage it with medication and monitoring. Ms. Santos will need to stay in the hospital for observation, but both she and the baby should be fine with proper care." Rachel felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she absorbed the news that Maria and her baby would be safe. "Can I see her?" Rachel asked. "Of course. She's been asking for you." Rachel entered Maria's hospital room to find her sitting up in bed, connected to monitoring equipment but looking more relieved than frightened. "Rachel," Maria said, "thank you for handling everything with the insurance and the coverage. I heard the nurses saying you spent hours making calls." "It was nothing," Rachel replied, though they both knew it hadn't been nothing. "It wasn't nothing," Maria said firmly. "3 weeks ago, you attacked me because you thought I was lazy or irresponsible. Today, you fought for me like I was family." The word family hit Rachel like a revelation, forcing her to confront how fundamentally her relationship with Maria had changed. "Maria," Rachel said, "I owe you an apology that goes far deeper than what happened on the street that day. I've spent my whole career claiming to help people like you while secretly believing that people in your situation had somehow brought it on themselves." Rachel sat down beside Maria's bed, her voice thick with emotion as she continued. "These past 3 weeks have shown me that you're stronger, braver, and more determined than I've ever been. You're facing challenges that would have broken me, and you're doing it with grace and optimism that I've never possessed even when everything in my life was easy." Maria reached out to take Rachel's hand, a gesture of forgiveness that Rachel felt she didn't deserve but desperately needed. "Rachel," Maria said, "you've been learning just like I've been learning. 3 weeks ago, I thought all successful people were heartless and selfish. You've shown me that people can change, that success doesn't have to mean losing your humanity." "But I attacked you," Rachel said, the guilt and shame of her behavior still raw despite the relationship they'd built. "I physically hurt you when you were vulnerable and pregnant. How can you forgive that?" "Because," Maria replied, "holding on to anger about what you did would hurt me more than it would hurt you. And because watching you change has given me hope that other people can change too." Maria adjusted her position in the hospital bed, her hand moving to rest on her baby bump. "This baby is going to grow up in a world where some people will judge him because of where he comes from or how much money his family has," Maria said. "I want him to see that people can learn to understand each other, that differences in background don't have to mean differences in worth." Rachel felt something fundamental shift inside her chest as she understood that Maria had been teaching her not just about resilience and strength, but about forgiveness and the possibility of transformation. "Maria," Rachel said, "I want you to know that working with you these past 3 weeks has changed me in ways I didn't think were possible. You've taught me what real courage looks like, what genuine grace means, and what it feels like to care about someone else's well-being more than my own convenience." "And you've taught me," Maria replied, "that people who seem cruel or heartless might just be scared or hurt in ways that make them forget how to be kind. You've shown me that second chances can lead to real friendship." As they sat together in the hospital room, Rachel realized that her service to Maria had become something far more valuable than professional rehabilitation or character reform. It had become a genuine relationship built on mutual respect, shared growth, and the kind of caring that neither of them had expected when David Chun had first proposed this arrangement. Rachel Sterling was discovering that the most powerful transformation comes not from being punished for your worst behavior, but from being given the opportunity to serve someone you've wronged and learning to see them as fully human rather than as a problem to be solved or a burden to be avoided. The cruel woman who had attacked a pregnant homeless woman was learning to become someone who fought for that same woman's well-being with the same intensity she'd once reserved for destroying opponents in court. And Maria Santos was learning that forgiveness didn't mean accepting cruelty, but rather believing that people could grow beyond their worst moments and become worthy of the second chances that make redemption possible. The showdown that would test everything Rachel had learned and reveal the full scope of David Chen's power came when Maria's abusive ex-boyfriend Carlos suddenly appeared at the hospital, threatening to claim parental rights and take Maria's baby unless she paid him money she didn't have. "Well, well," came a harsh voice from a hospital room doorway as Carlos Mendoza stepped inside with the predatory confidence of someone who had tracked down his prey. "Look what we have here, Maria playing house with her rich friend." Rachel felt Maria's hand tighten in hers as terror replaced the peaceful recovery atmosphere they'd been building over the past 2 days. Carlos was exactly as Maria had described him during their conversations about her past: tall, intimidating, and carrying himself with the casual menace of someone who enjoyed using fear to control others. "Carlos," Maria whispered, instinctively moving to protect her baby bump even while lying in the hospital bed. "How did you find me?" "Wasn't hard," Carlos said with malicious satisfaction, sliding uninvited into the room despite the obvious distress his presence was causing. "Word gets around when someone's playing the victim and getting special treatment from bleeding hearts with money." Rachel stood up immediately, positioning herself between Carlos and Maria's bed with protective instincts that surprised her with their intensity. "You need to leave," Rachel said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once used to intimidate opposing counsel. "Maria is recovering from a medical emergency, and you're not welcome here." Carlos laughed, a sound without warmth that suggested he viewed Rachel as an amusing obstacle rather than a serious threat. "And who are you supposed to be?" Carlos asked with dismissive contempt. "Maria's lawyer? Her social worker? Another do-gooder who thinks she can save the world by adopting a charity case." "I'm her friend," Rachel said simply, the word carrying more weight and meaning than any professional title she'd ever held. "Her friend," Carlos repeated mockingly. "How sweet. Did Maria tell you about our history together? About how she left me without paying back the money she owed? About how she disappeared with my baby?" The claim that Maria's baby belonged to Carlos sent shock waves through the room, and Rachel could see Maria's face go white with fear. "He's not your baby," Maria said firmly, though her voice shook with terror. "You know he's not your baby, Carlos." "Do I?" Carlos asked with the same malicious enjoyment Rachel had seen in Derek Williams when he threatened Maya. "Because I seem to remember you being real cozy with me right around the time this baby would have been conceived." Rachel realized she was witnessing the same kind of extortion attempt that had been used against Maya: false paternity claims designed to terrorize vulnerable women and extract money or control. "Furthermore," Carlos continued, pulling out what appeared to be legal documents, "I've got papers here that show I can claim paternity rights. DNA tests, custody filings, the whole thing." Carlos stepped closer to Maria's bed, his voice taking on the threatening tone that had once made her comply with his demands. "So here's how this is going to work, Maria. You're going to sign over temporary custody to me until we can sort out our financial arrangements. And your rich friend here is going to help us reach an understanding about what my silence is worth." When someone threatens the person you've learned to love and protect, how do you balance the desire for immediate action with the need for strategic thinking that will actually keep them safe? Rachel felt rage building in her chest, not the self-centered anger that had driven her attack on Maria, but protective fury focused entirely on defending someone she'd come to care about deeply. "Mr. Mendoza," Rachel said, her legal training kicking in as she began to assess Carlos's vulnerabilities and the best strategy for protecting Maria, "I think you should be very careful about the claims you're making and the threats you're issuing." "Should I?" Carlos asked with false bravado. "And why is that?" "Because," Rachel replied, pulling out her phone with deliberate calm, "threatening a pregnant woman in a hospital room while attempting to extort money through false paternity claims is a serious crime that's currently being recorded." Carlos's confident expression flickered as he realized that Rachel wasn't the easy target he'd expected. But Rachel wasn't finished demonstrating that Carlos had made a catastrophic mistake by threatening Maria in front of someone with both legal knowledge and powerful connections. "Security to room 314, Rachel said into her phone, though she was actually calling David Chen's personal number. "We have an unwelcome visitor making threats against a patient." "Mr. Chen," Rachel continued as David answered, "I'm at the hospital with Maria, and we have a situation that requires immediate intervention." Carlos looked confused and increasingly nervous as he heard Rachel speaking to someone with obvious authority and resources. "Carlos Mendoza has appeared here claiming parental rights and threatening Maria unless she pays him money," Rachel explained to David. "He's using the same intimidation tactics we've seen before, and I think he needs to understand what happens when people threaten Chen Foundation scholarship recipients." David Chen's response was immediate and comprehensive, revealing the full scope of his power and his commitment to protecting people under his foundation's care. "Mr. Mendoza," Rachel said after ending the call, "I want you to understand that you've just threatened someone under the protection of the Chen Foundation, and that's about to have consequences you haven't anticipated." "Chen Foundation?" Carlos repeated, his bravado beginning to crack as he realized he might have targeted someone with powerful allies. "David Chen is one of the most influential philanthropists in New York," Rachel explained, watching Carlos's face as the implications sank in. "He has personal relationships with law enforcement, immigration services, and social welfare agencies throughout the city." Rachel's phone buzzed with a text message that she read aloud to demonstrate the speed and efficiency of David Chen's response. "Mr. Chen has just informed the hospital security director about your presence here," Rachel said. "He's also contacted Detective Rodriguez about your harassment of a pregnant woman, and he's requested a background check on your legal status and any outstanding warrants." Carlos's face went pale as he realized that his intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly. "This isn't over," Carlos said, but his voice lacked conviction as he began to understand that threatening Maria had brought him to the attention of people with the power to make his life very difficult. "Actually," Rachel said, "it is over. As of right now, Maria and her baby are under the official protection of the Chen Foundation. Any further contact with her will be considered harassment and will be handled through legal channels that will cost you more than you can afford." That's when David Chen himself appeared in the hospital room doorway, having arrived with the speed that suggested he'd been nearby when Rachel called. "Mr. Mendoza," David Chen said, stepping into the room with two hospital security officers, "I understand you've been making threats against one of our scholarship recipients." Carlos looked from David Chen to the security officers to Rachel, finally understanding that he had stumbled into a situation far more complex and dangerous than he'd anticipated. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Carlos said, his intimidating demeanor crumbling as he faced people with real power and authority. "Has there?" David Chen asked. "Because from what I understand, you've claimed false paternity rights, threatened a pregnant woman recovering from a medical emergency, and attempted to extort money from someone under our foundation's protection." David Chen gestured toward the security officers. "Mr. Mendoza will be escorted from the premises immediately, and a restraining order will be filed to prevent any further contact with Ms. Santos or her child." As Carlos was led away by security, David Chen turned to Rachel with an expression that mixed approval with respect. "Ms. Sterling," David Chen said, "you handled that situation exactly as I hoped you would. You protected Maria, used your legal knowledge strategically, and called for help when you needed it." Rachel looked at Maria, who was staring at her with obvious gratitude and affection. "I was just protecting my friend," Rachel said, the word carrying all the growth and transformation she'd experienced over the past month. "Indeed," David Chen replied. "And that protection demonstrates that you've learned something much more important than legal strategy or professional competence. You've learned what it means to care about someone else's well-being more than your own comfort or convenience." As the immediate crisis passed and Maria's safety was secured, Rachel understood that she just passed the most important test of her transformation. Not a test of her professional skills or legal knowledge, but a test of her willingness to use whatever power and privilege she possessed to protect someone she'd learned to love. The woman who had once attacked Maria out of cruelty had just defended her with fierce determination, proving that redemption was possible through service, that character could be transformed through caring, and that the strongest people were those who used their strength to protect rather than dominate others. The climactic reversal that would complete Rachel Sterling's transformation came 6 months later, when Maria Santos gave birth to a healthy baby boy and asked Rachel to serve as the child's godmother, a request that revealed how completely their relationship had evolved from victim and attacker to family bound by choice rather than blood. "His name is David," Maria said, cradling her newborn son in the private hospital room that the Chun Foundation had provided for her delivery. "David Santos, named after Mr. Chun, who gave us both the chance to become better than we were." Rachel felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the baby who represented not just Maria's new beginning as a mother, but her own rebirth as someone capable of unconditional love and genuine service to others. "He's perfect," Rachel whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "Absolutely perfect." "Rachel," Maria said, "I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll say yes." Rachel looked up from baby David's face to meet Maria's eyes, seeing in them the trust and affection that had grown between them over months of shared challenges and mutual support. "I want you to be David's godmother," Maria said. "Not because of obligation or because Mr. Chen arranged it, but because you've become my sister, and I want you to help me raise him to be someone who knows how to love and forgive and fight for people who need protection." The request hit Rachel like a revelation, forcing her to confront how completely her life had been transformed by learning to serve rather than dominate someone she'd once viewed as beneath her consideration. "Maria," Rachel said, "I would be honored to be David's godmother. More honored than I've ever been about anything in my life." As Rachel held baby David for the first time, she understood that she was holding not just Maria's son, but the living symbol of everything she'd learned about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of transformation through genuine service to others. But the most meaningful moment came when David Chun arrived at the hospital to meet the baby who bore his name and to make an announcement that would surprise everyone in the room. "Maria," Rachel, David Chun said, settling into the chair beside Maria's bed, "I want you both to know that watching your relationship develop over the past 6 months has been one of the most inspiring experiences of my life." He looked at Rachel with obvious respect and affection. "Rachel, when I first witnessed your attack on Maria, I was tempted to simply destroy your career and move on. But something about Maria's response to your cruelty, her immediate forgiveness and her belief that people could change, convinced me that justice through service might be more powerful than justice through punishment." David Chun pulled out an envelope that contained information that would reshape both women's futures. The Chun Foundation is launching a new program called Second Chances, a legal clinic that will provide representation for women facing domestic violence, housing discrimination, and employment challenges related to poverty or pregnancy. He handed the envelope to Rachel. "Rachel, I'm offering you the position of director for this program. You'll use your legal skills to help women in circumstances similar to what Maria faced, and you'll train other attorneys to approach vulnerable clients with the empathy and respect you've learned to demonstrate. When someone offers you the opportunity to turn your worst mistake into your life's greatest purpose, how do you process the possibility that redemption can become service to others?" Rachel stared at the offer, understanding that David Chun was providing her with a chance to build a career around protecting people like Maria rather than just serving wealthy clients who could afford her aggressive tactics. "Furthermore," David Chun continued, "Maria will serve as the program's client advocate coordinator, using her experience navigating social services and her nursing training to help other women access the resources they need." Maria looked at Rachel with excitement about the possibility of working together to help other women avoid the struggles they both experienced. "We'll be partners," Maria said, "helping people who are facing the same challenges I faced when you first met me. But most importantly," David Chun added, "you'll be doing this work as family. Because what you've built together over the past 6 months proves that the strongest bonds are the ones we choose to create through love and service, rather than the ones we inherit through circumstance." 1 year later, Rachel Sterling stood in the offices of the Second Chances Legal Clinic, watching Maria Santos Chun. She legally added David Chen's name to honor their surrogate father relationship, train a new group of attorneys about respectful client interaction and trauma-informed legal practice. "The most important thing to remember," Maria was telling the lawyers, "is that every client who comes through our doors is someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone who deserves dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances." Rachel nodded from the back of the room, remembering when she'd needed to learn those same lessons through forced service and gradually discovered that caring for others was more fulfilling than any professional victory she'd ever achieved. The Second Chances Legal Clinic had become exactly what David Chun had envisioned, a place where attorneys learned to use their skills for justice rather than just profit, where vulnerable women received representation that treated them as whole human beings rather than just legal problems to be solved. But the most beautiful outcome was something that couldn't be measured in cases won or lives changed. It was the family that had formed around little David, who was growing up surrounded by adults who had learned that love was stronger than cruelty, that forgiveness was more powerful than revenge, and that service to others was the most reliable path to personal fulfillment. Tia Rachel, 18-month-old David called out as Rachel picked him up from his play area in the clinic's childcare center. He'd started calling her Aunt Rachel months earlier, and the title meant more to her than any professional recognition she'd ever received. "Hi, sweet boy," Rachel said, holding him close while marveling at how this child had become the center of a family built on redemption rather than biology. "Did you have a good day with Miss Patricia?" As the workday ended and they prepared to go home to the apartment that Rachel and Maria shared as co-parents and best friends, Rachel reflected on how completely her understanding of success had been transformed. 2 years earlier, she'd measured success by billable hours, case victories, and the fear she could inspire in opposing counsel. Now she measured success by the number of women who left their clinic feeling heard and protected, by little David's laughter when she read him bedtime stories, and by the knowledge that her work was making the world safer for vulnerable people rather than just more profitable for wealthy clients. "Rachel," Maria said as they walked to the car with David between them, "do you ever regret the way everything happened? Do you ever wish you could go back and handle that first meeting differently?" Rachel considered the question, thinking about the cruel woman she'd been and the path that had led her to attack a pregnant stranger on a city sidewalk. "I regret hurting you," Rachel said honestly. "I regret the pain I caused and the cruelty I showed. But I don't regret where we ended up, because I could never have imagined that my worst moment would lead to the best life I've ever had." Maria squeezed Rachel's hand as they secured David in his car seat. "Mr. Chun was right about second chances," Maria said. "Sometimes the people who hurt us the most can become the people who love us the best, if they're willing to do the work of changing." As they drove home to the family they'd chosen to create together, Rachel Sterling understood that the most profound transformation comes not from being punished for your cruelty, but from being given the opportunity to serve someone you've wronged and discovering that caring for others heals your own wounded heart in ways you never imagined possible. The woman who had once attacked a pregnant homeless woman had learned to love that same woman's child as her own, proving that redemption is always possible for people brave enough to choose service over selfishness and love over the fear that drives cruelty. Sometimes our worst mistakes become our greatest opportunities to discover who we're capable of becoming when we stop trying to protect ourselves and start learning to protect others. Sometimes the people we hurt become our greatest teachers about forgiveness, grace, and the healing power of chosen family. And sometimes a baby's laughter becomes the soundtrack to a life rebuilt on love rather than success, service rather than domination, and the understanding that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.